Hi everybody, this is my presentation that I would like to do today, strategies to help Mandarin L1 speakers avoid common academic writing and pragmatic errors. My name is Emma Harries. I intend to present strategies based on my own experience, research and my own knowledge of Mandarin, which is somewhat limited, but I did live in Taiwan for 8 years and I have taught academic English for almost 20 years. Furthermore, I worked as an IELTS examiner for 7 years, so I've seen a lot of writing by Mandarin L1 speakers. Okay, so why should we talk about Mandarin L1 speakers as a unique group? Well, they're by far the largest group of students coming from one area. Around a third of our international students in the US come from China. But of course, the education system, their experience of education may well be very different to that of students growing up in the US. So let's have a look at what can affect students' writing and understanding of English. Firstly, I'd like to have a look at grammar and the expression of time. Secondly, I intend to discuss vocabulary and some common L1 transfers that we meet. And finally is my favourite topic, pragmatics, and we'll focus on excuse making in particular. So let's begin by talking about grammar and time. Now, lots of teachers in the staff room and myself often ask these questions. Why do my students frequently forget to use the past tense? And why do they often avoid present perfect altogether? Now, this one, I often teach a class that involves teaching a lot of present perfect. And we'll do, we'll study it in class, we'll talk about how to use it, we'll do a test, and then I get all these essays that have no attempts at using present perfect. I find my students often avoid it. So let's have a look at why that happens. And this is important. Chinese is a tenseless language. So if we have a look, and we translate word for word how time is expressed in Chinese, we come to a literal translation, I yesterday go Beijing. Rather than, of course, in English, I went to Beijing yesterday. Went, of course, being completely different from go. 我昨天去北京. That's my finest Chinese. I'm a bit worried that I've got all my tones wrong, however, because as we've mentioned, there is a big distance between Chinese and English. Okay, so if you are a Mandarin speaker, please forgive me. Okay. The same goes for future tense. I tomorrow go Beijing. So again, we haven't changed go. We didn't need to change the verb at all. Whereas, of course, in English, I will go to Beijing tomorrow. And I'll save you my tones for that one. Okay. So another issue that that comes up here, of course, is the fact that it's understandable. Meaning is communicated. If a student says to you, I yesterday go Beijing, or I go Beijing on the weekend, we can understand exactly what they're saying. So we can see why those errors become concrete. And in fact, one researcher found that one particular Chinese L1 speaker still used mostly bare verbs in English, even after 18 years of living in the US. And because meaning can be made without them. So it does cause problems. Now, while I was researching this, I came across a blog that was very funny and very sympathetic to Chinese learners of English. And I couldn't resist sharing a little bit with you. So we meet our learners after we've discussed the number of words that they need to learn, and something else that was painful, I forget exactly. So let's take swimming as an example. In Chinese, swim is yo-yong. So I went for a swim yesterday is I yesterday go yo-yong. I like swimming. I like yo-yong. If you want to say I swam from China to Australia, you just say I from China yo-yong go or arrive Australia. And she swims every day becomes she every day yo-yong. Here we are, very subtle pattern. Nothing but yo-yong for days, as it were. But this is where it becomes painful for our students. More bad news. We've already told the kids Santa doesn't exist and their dog is dead. Get ready to cut them and pour salt in the wound, because now you have to explain that in order to say yo-yong, they have to learn swim, swims, swimming, swam, and of course swum. So if you would like to see that blog for yourself, it's very entertaining, but also very true, I think. Okay, so I do recommend having a look at that. Now, as far as strategies go, in my experience, making errors explicit and highlighting them can improve awareness. Okay. I'll always use verbal reminders. I like to ask students what they did at the weekend, and of course, very often they'll forget to use past tense, so I shall usually do this to try and remind them that it's happened in the past. Okay. I think it's important for us to deal with avoidance. And once we're aware of it, of course, we'll notice it far more. But I think it's something that particularly if you've got students over a whole semester, over 15 weeks, I think it's important for us to deal with it and address it. It is an ongoing process throughout the semester. So my advice is to focus on essay introductions. The reason for this is because they're very often formulaic. They're quite dull, the essay introductions that I see. However, they're very often describing recent events or things that are affecting us now, which means that it's a great chance for us to help students risk a bit of grammar in that introduction. Okay. It's relatively low stakes. They're not desperately trying to argue for something or compare and contrast something. It's just the introduction. It's just a bit of background. So I feel it's really a good chance to reward risk taking. Now, on the topic of introductions, if you have seen many essays written by Mandarin L1 speakers, you will know this. You will recognize the overuse of more and more. So many essays begin with, these days, more and more people verb. My all-time favorite being, these days, food is more and more important. Well, presumably people in the past didn't eat. I'm not sure. Anyway. And this is a direct translation of yue lai yue, which is a very common construction in Mandarin, meaning more and more or becoming more so. Okay. And of course, this is a good opportunity for us to be using present perfect. Students should be using present perfect at this time. Now, it's not enough just to point these things out. I find it's quite effective to encourage competitiveness. So if I've got a good example of an introduction, I'll grab it, pop it on the .cam. Hey everybody, let's have a look at Lynn's introduction. Why is this so good? Why do I like it? What's he doing that's so good? And I also like to give my students error worksheets, as many of us do after an essay. What were some common errors? I find it really effective to include some examples of good work. Why do I like this? Now, I'll always use the name for the good stuff. The errors, I always like to make those anonymous. But the good stuff, I like to put a name on it and show off students' good work. Okay, so I've highlighted it for our benefit here. I wouldn't do that normally. I would ask the students to read it carefully and try and identify what I like in these. Okay. Another tense that students can struggle with, perhaps bizarrely, but if we explain it, it becomes a bit clearer. I find students overuse always or will. They don't utilize present simple enough to emphasize habit or routine or fact. Okay, now there's a reason for that, because Mandarin will use time markers. So Mandarin is using time markers rather than tense to emphasize a habit. So that's why we very often read constructions or hear constructions. I always go to the supermarket. Parents always want their students to do well. And a simple strategy for that is simply that I ask the students to avoid always. There's other reasons why that's a benefit, obviously, but it can be an effective way to get students to remember to use present simple this way. I'm just going to check my time, see how I'm doing. There we go. Okay. Now, of course, this doesn't happen overnight. It may take several essays and many examples of this before students appreciate that this is something they do need to get to grips with. And I'll make it very explicit that students who attempt this are rewarded. So even if it's not perfect the first time, I will reward those students. I will make sure everybody knows that I am rewarding those students. And as the semester goes on and students want their grades to improve, I suddenly start to see more present simple and more present perfect. Now, what works for you? Do you have strategies that work like this? Are you willing to share them with us? I would love to know what you've got. Please, I've made a Google Doc for us. Here's the address. I'll show it again later on. Please let me know what works for you, what's successful. So let's move on to talk about vocabulary. I couldn't resist this little card. It's just a little panda. It's for Chinese New Year, so it's a little bit early, but there we go. Now, the first thing I'd like to mention when it comes to vocabulary is the number of words in English compared to Chinese. Now, this is very difficult to get into in much detail, because this is quite controversial. How do you count how many words there are? So what I've decided to go with, I've compared the printed dictionaries, the largest printed dictionaries that are available right now, and that gives us Merriam-Webster with 470,000 words, and Zhonghua Zihai, I'm not quite sure, please forgive my dreadful pronunciation, with 85,000 characters. So whatever metrics we use to compare them, we do find that English tends to have far more words than Chinese. And this bears out somewhat anecdotally when we consider positive adjectives. Now, myself and a number of my friends who are living in China or Taiwan agree with me on this, that Chinese seems to have quite a limited number of positive adjectives, and I suspect that this stems from a limited number of words. So, for example, we might have hao, meaning good. Zhen hao is very good. Fei chang hao is really good. But compared to English, this seems somewhat limited. So in English, we might have good, wonderful, brilliant, fabulous, excellent, terrific, outstanding, incredible, top banana. Maybe that last one's just for us Brits. I'm not sure. So let's have a look at what this can mean in terms of L1 transfer. Here's something I hear quite often. I wish I can do well in the test. So students confusing wish and hope. I lived in a hotel for 3 days, mixing up live and stay. And there's a simple reason is that those are not differentiated as verbs in Chinese. There's just one verb that stands in for both those ideas in Chinese. So that's something to be aware of and correct for students. Okay. Another one I see a lot is there have. So I'll hear phrases like there have many students in our class, there have more and more pollution. And again, this comes from Mandarin. To express that something exists in Mandarin, we'll use the verb have. So have mountains, have lakes is the equivalent of there are mountains and lakes. And this is something I'll correct with students, but I've also noticed that students tend to underuse there plus be structures. So in addition to an underuse of present simple, very often I'll find an underuse of there and be when it would be appropriate. So being aware of this when you're grading can really help. It can help you understand, what's wrong with this sentence? The student needed to use there are or there is. It can also just help with adding variety to sentence structure. So again, this is something that I tell students, I'll reward you for using this structure accurately. Just a couple more things in terms of vocabulary that I find useful to know. Students often talk about body rather than health. So my students always like to talk about keeping a healthy body. So that can be a useful one to correct with students. Now, although we've talked about Chinese having fewer words than English, I also find that L1 transfer can lead to some redundancy. And of course, when our students are trying to write academically, they're trying to be succinct. And of course, that's incredibly difficult in a second language. So just a couple of things that can help students just, cut some words out. We can get rid of 比以前. Comparison constructions in Mandarin need than before. Okay. Most memorably for me, after I came back from the salon, was a colleague saying, "Oh, Emma, your hair looks better than before." Oh, thank you very much. Here we go. Or perhaps in an essay we might meet, with the new laws, traffic is better than before. And of course, English doesn't require than before. So this can be a useful thing to get rid of. Let's throw that out and try and make our writing a little bit more succinct. One more aspect of this is myself. Relax myself. I read relax myself so often. I like to relax myself on the weekend. So of course we can get rid of myself there. Moving on to vocabulary and he and she. I know a lot of teachers wonder why students often confuse he and she when speaking and even writing at the lower levels. And it's very simple. Spoken Chinese, there's only one word for he and she. I can't help but think that English would benefit from the same, but there we go. So ta is the same for he and she in Chinese. However, in written Chinese, that's slightly different. So he in writing is different because she will incorporate the radical for female. So this means woman in Mandarin, and that becomes squashed up, becomes a radical and added on to ta to show that it's female. And it can be helpful to ask students to just picture that in their head, picture the word when they're saying it, to help them try and remember to use she rather than he. Okay, one more time check. I'm okay. Let's move on to my final aspect I want to talk about, and that is pragmatics. I love this. Okay. So, why do my students often give such annoyingly vague or inappropriate excuses? Oh, teacher, I can't come to class. I have something to do. Now, if that was a native speaker that wrote that to me, I would be quite annoyed. And I think it's really interesting to analyze why would that be annoying. Let's try and have a think about that. What's going on here? Now, a Chinese friend of mine sent me this years ago, and I love this. I think this explains it really well. And anytime I put this up on the board for my students, they laugh. They get it right away. This was done by an artist, a Chinese woman who moved to Germany when she was 14. And she's done all these lovely pictures comparing cultural differences. Okay. Now we can see that on the left is the German approach, where we've got a problem. We're going to walk straight through the problem, face it head on, deal with it directly. The Chinese approach is going to step around the problem, and we're going to come on to this in a minute, this idea of touching the point marginally. Okay. Now, this was a real email that I had from a student. Hello, teacher. Again, that's a direct translation. 老师. Hello, teacher. I'm blah, blah. I'm sorry I cannot attend today's class because there are other important things to deal with. Can I put my speech in the next lecture? So he was looking for an extension. Okay, now, what's wrong with this is that he is using this idea of touching the point marginally. He's transferring that into English. And this was first identified by Liao and Bresnahan in 1996. I'll give you a link to the paper at the end of my presentation. I think this is fascinating. I really enjoy this. So I've got a little summary of their findings. What they do is they compare refusal strategies among American English speakers, as students at an American university, and students at a university in Taiwan whose first language is Mandarin. And they compare excuses. So what they found was, and they mentioned the findings of Clark and Shunk, what they found is that in American English, if one is unable to comply with a request, or one is unable to meet one's obligations, what in American English, what people will do is firstly apologize for not complying, explain why one cannot comply, and responses that contain a good reason are more polite than those without. And that's the crunch, is that it's important to have a good reason in American English, or British English for that matter. Good detailed reasons make excuses credible, make them believable, and make the listener feel better about hearing the refusal or the excuse. But Mandarin values something completely different. The refusals are also characterized by an apology and an excuse, but they use fewer tokens. The emphasis is on 点到为止, or touching the point marginally. And what's most important, what's valued most by Mandarin speakers, is ending this awkward exchange as quickly as possible. We're not going to talk it over for hours on end. We're not going to give long lists of detailed reasons. We just want it to end as quickly as possible. And I love this. I suspect perhaps I was Chinese in a former lifetime, or perhaps this is a difference between Brits and Americans. I don't know, but I want to end that awkward exchange as quickly as possible as well. Definitely. Okay. Now, how can we use this in the classroom? How can we talk about this in the classroom? I feel that linguists find this very interesting. Other people don't know anything about it. Other people don't know why that excuse sounds rude. They haven't studied pragmatics in the same way. So I'll introduce it in the classroom. I'll talk about it in the classroom. I'll show these infographics. I really think it's fun to talk about this. And I'll talk to students about what's an appropriate excuse, what's valued, by speakers of English in terms of an excuse or in terms of a refusal. And the students usually get it right away and understand it. And it's good fun. It's definitely good fun to have a go at this. Alrighty, so as promised, here are those links. I've included a QR code for anybody who wants to just do this quickly. Just put your camera over that and it'll give you the link. The link should pop up on that on your phone. Or alternatively, I've got the link at the bottom there. I'd love to know what your experiences are, how things are going for you with Mandarin L1 writers. How are they doing? What works in your classroom? I've also included some further reading at the end of my presentation here. Grab a photo of that if you are interested. I'll also put these links on the shared Google Doc, so you can have a look at those if you want to. I hope you enjoyed my talk today. I enjoyed putting it together, and I will hopefully see you all online at MA TESOL on the 17th.